Good morning, and thank you very much for joining us today at this session entitled, Is the African Renaissance for Real? To discuss the African continent, sub-Saharan Africa, and the remarkable improvement in performance in that region over the last 10 years or so. And whether that improvement in performance is in fact sustainable, whether the Renaissance is for real. And to address this, we have 4 panelists selected in the traditional manner of the Carnegie International Economics Program. In other words, these are people who really know what the subject in depth, I'm not going to read their very impressive CVs because you have them. Let me just welcome then in alphabetical order Harry Broadman, who is Vice President, Albright Stonebridge Group and Chief Economist of Albright Capital Management. And Shanta Devarajan, Chief Economist for the Africa region of the World Bank, and Mwangi Kimeni, Director for the African Growth Initiative at the Brookings Institution, and Vincent Palmade, Lead Economist, Private and Financial Sector Group, Africa region of the World Bank. And 3 of these gentlemen are friends, old friends and colleagues of mine. The 3 on the right. This gentleman here is from the competition, right next door, and he's here so that I can understand their strengths and weaknesses better in the course of the next hour and a half. I'm going to deal with, I'm going to basically ask a series of questions, structured questions, which I can't find.
I have a copy.
You have them there?
Oh, really? I think this was the...
Yeah, right. Okay. Thank you. Basically going to structure the conversation along 3 chapters. The first is the big picture, what's been happening overall. The second part of the conversation will be on sectors of the African economy. And the third will be the third part of the conversation will be about the global community and how it affects Africa. I'm going to ask questions directed at 1 or 2 speakers. Then in about an hour or so, we will open up for questions from the audience. So let me start with the big picture. And I'd like to direct the first question to Shanta. The first question is in 2 parts, really. The first part is why did per capita incomes in sub-Saharan Africa decline for an extended period in the 80s and the 90s? And what changed around 2000 to explain the acceleration that we have seen?
Okay, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. In fact, I think the answers to the 2 questions boil down to the same answer, which is governance. The reason why per capita income declined in the 80s and 90s was that there was an amazing and quite widespread breakdown in economic governance in African countries. You had a series of military dictatorships that were mainly interested in serving one particular part of the population rather than the population as a whole. Let me just give you the example of Ghana. I mean, Ghana was under a military dictatorship. Well, if you're a military dictator, you mainly want to keep food prices low so your urban elite, and the soldiers in particular, can get cheap food, which meant that Ghana ran an overvalued exchange rate. and food prices were very low, so farmers got nothing, and the whole agricultural sector basically collapsed, particularly the cocoa sector. And the economy collapsed. As we know, Ghana suffered a major crisis in the 1980s. That same mechanism worked in reverse when you saw democracy come in. You had a democratically elected government. Jerry Rawlings started running for president as an elected leader. It suddenly became very clear that he needed the rural vote in order to get elected. And that's flipped the decision making. All of a sudden, you needed high food prices so that farmers could actually get a return on their earnings, because that's what made the difference for him. And so we started seeing Ghana no longer running overvalued exchange rates. They were actually running undervalued exchange rates. Growth was averaging about 6.6%, and it sustained itself to this day. And Ghana, I should add, is one of 4 or 5 African countries that's on track to reach the Millennium Development Goal of a 50% reduction in poverty by 2015.
Manji, do you agree with that, or do you want to point some other factors? In particular, are some factors more permanent, other factors more temporary?
Thank you very much for inviting me here. We refer to our friends here as competitor colleagues. So I'm happy to be here and to discuss about this very important issue on Africa. I do agree a lot with what Shanta has said. I think the broad topic is about African Renaissance and whether it's for real. And one of the things that I was wondering is whether that term is actually itself correct. If you look at the meaning of that term, it means a break with the past. You know, for example, the shift from medieval world to the modern world. And I would say that I would not use that term because what we have seen is economic growth, but it's not necessarily a major break from the past in terms of everything has changed. We are doing things in a different way. So I would be very cautious using that actually we had a clear break from the way we have been doing business. What we have seen is clear change in the way we deal with economic policies, as Shanta has said, but rooted in clear reforms in terms of institutions. I think institutions have been the lead in this, so I would agree with that. But I think we also need to think about to what extent can we account for economic growth on just the process of democracy? And one would like to refer to the North African case and say, I mean, then what has been going to the North African case where you had all these changes with a bit limited in terms of institutional changes. So it's partly true, but it's bigger than that. And you know, in terms of other factors, particularly, we have changed the business environment. We have more in terms of investments. We have better macroeconomic management and all that.
Good. Let me ask Vincent and Harry whether which factors in the acceleration of Africa's growth in the last 10 years you would consider to be permanent, yeah, or sort of semi-permanent. Nothing is permanent. And which would you consider temporary?
I want to also thank you very much for inviting me and reuniting me with my brethren from the World Bank, including yourself. And I also think it's important, I thought a lot about not only the title of this session, but the essay that was written that engendered this session, and not only frankly take issue with the notion of the term Renaissance, but I think the notion of the term Africa. Africa is not a country. It's not even terribly a useful, economically meaningful term. And I think one should disaggregate quite quickly at the beginning of this discussion that there are many countries in Africa. We can use very different taxonomies. So although we're using Africa here as a shorthand, it really is a shorthand for a great heterogeneous continent. I think with respect to your question and playing off of the previous two comments, I think one of the issues I think that has not been touched upon and which I think is permanent is the integration into international markets. And the vast majority of African countries are now members of the WTO. That is both a result of greater governance, better macroeconomic and microeconomic management, but it has a self-reinforcing effect on competition, on greater efficiency, on African firms, on engendering foreign direct investment. There is also the great effect of remittances coming back in to the continent from African workers abroad. It has also engendered, I think, an increasing amount, though still limited, diversification of some of the African countries from sole reliance on certain commodities. I think what may not be so permanent, to be frank, are the changes in governance and changes in the political realm. And what we're witnessing now in northern Africa, north of the Sahara, I think there's an open question, at least in my mind, and from people who I work with in the field now, about what's going to happen perhaps in Uganda. Not just because of Museveni and his stronghold on the economy, but what the development of oil is going to mean in the way that that has been handled. I think the election results, frankly, in Gabon are coming to light about how those were conducted. We don't even have to talk about Zimbabwe, but I think that the Cote d'Ivoire situation. So I'm not sure that we've come, we've made some progress, but I think, as in all cases, this is not yet a permanent trend, and there will be backslide. So I don't think that's a transitory set of issues.
Well, I think there are a lot of structural good news which should make one confident that the positive trend is going to continue. But let me start with the one which could be seen as not necessarily permanent. If you look at the growth in exports, and exports from Africa has grown 3 to 4 times in the last 10 years, 73% of that growth was actually related to mining resources. And if you look into that, it's mostly prices and a little bit of volume increase. So if one believes that commodity prices are bound to go through cycles, one could question whether this is going to last. That's the not so good news. The good news, and let me take this opportunity to actually challenge a little bit what Shanta said, because if you take a country like Senegal, which has been a democracy for a very long time, GDP per capita in Senegal did not grow nevertheless. So there's something else going on. And I think, but the good news is that there's something else going on. And I think we went from bad economic policies to much better economic policies, including in Senegal. Policies which were essentially import substitution driven, as well as policies which depended too much on large, not sustainable budget deficits. So most countries in Africa, including democracies, had to go through a painful period of adjustment, structural adjustments, both in terms of reducing the budget deficit, as well as opening up the economy so that the future growth becomes sustainable. And I think the hard job has been done for the most part, and that's the good news. Now, as Iris said, whatever is going to grow or is growing now in Africa, it should be expected to be sustained, because now it's really on a level playing field with the rest of the world. And so beyond mining, the next sectors you should expect to see is agriculture and eventually light manufacturing. These are the 2 big opportunities coming up, and also big challenges. But beyond mining, there's a bright future.
I want to come back to the sectors in a moment. Let me ask first, just again to complete the broad picture. Africa certainly has accelerated in the last 10 years. But if you compare African countries with some others, and particularly the countries we're most concerned with in Africa, the low-income countries of Africa, and you compare them with some of the countries in Asia that are also low-income or were low-income, whether you are thinking Vietnam, Laos, or Myanmar, for example, you still see quite a large gap in terms of relative growth rates. Is that correct, Shanta? If it is correct, why are they growing so much faster?
Well, I think you're making the same mistake that Harry was warning us against, of comparing Africa, which is a continent of 47 countries, with Laos and Myanmar, which are individual countries. There are countries in Africa that are growing as fast, if not faster, than Laos and Vietnam and Myanmar. But there are lots of others that are growing much more slowly, and some of them are not growing at all. Yeah. And so you have that whole variation. And then if you look at why are these countries growing faster, so much faster, the fast-growing ones, a lot of it is not that different from the reasons why Laos and Vietnam are growing. These are the countries that have undertaken structural policy reforms of the type that Vincent was describing. They're countries with a reasonable amount of political stability, maybe not as high as we would like. And also, some of them are able to now manage their natural resources better. And so they're attracting foreign investment and actually being able to use those resources in a productive way. So I think it's comparable. But I think I want to come back to Harry's point, which is extremely important, is that there's still a large number, and the number that I think about is the 20 fragile states in Africa. That are not growing, and they're growing much more, and they haven't been growing for a long time. And indeed, I think that's where we should be putting our emphasis these days, is to see how we can help those countries move out of this conflict and fragility trap.
Manju, do you want to add on that?
Yeah. Just briefly, I think in terms of, again, it's very important to disaggregate these countries, remove the oil countries, and because the drivers are different. Coastal are sometimes different from the landlocked, North Africa, and so on. And but if you look at the countries that are doing well and they are not natural resource rich countries, they have tried to diversify their economies, and they have become competitive in particular sectors, particular services also. And for some countries, like let's say like Kenya, what we have seen in recent years has been ICT, a big contribution by mobile banking and the such. Those have been quite important. But going back to the issue of how is this, what is temporary and what is permanent? Well, again, I really think that we have to be careful. You have to look at the fundamentals, and growth is driven by people. And you have to ask yourself, what has changed with the people? Well, look at the education levels, look at the quality of education. I mean, those have not changed at all.
They have not changed.
They haven't changed. I mean, the quality of education is still very low. Yeah. I mean, people who transit to secondary schools are still very few. So if you are going to be competitive, you have to think about all those factors. So we see this boom, but in the long run, there are a lot of underlying issues that could reverse the process. Let me add also one more point. I think the growth we have seen is so much also dependent on outside countries, like developed countries, as we have been talking about trading, opening our markets. But we haven't opened our markets to our neighbors. It's still very difficult to trade with our neighbors. And if we don't do that, there's no way you can sustain growth for a long time. So
our neighbors being the other African countries.
The other African countries. So I'm thinking about trading within our own countries. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Vincent, do you agree that there are very big differences across African countries when you look at, particularly in terms of export performance that you have been examining?
Yes, absolutely. And gentleman just mentioned Kenya with ICT. Kenya has also historically has done very well with agriculture. I think countries like Ghana, which was mentioned also, is becoming an agriculture also powerhouse. So, and then there are new countries like Lesotho, who is becoming competitive in light manufacturing, which is very good news because we know how important light manufacturing has been to other developing countries in their growth paths. So Lesotho and Mauritius is showing the way. And then you have countries like Cape Verde, who did very well with tourism and Botswana with mining. So these bright spots are terribly important because they show the way in many different sectors. It's not only different countries, it's also different sectors. So collectively, they show what can be done.
Even though collectively, as you said, the export performance has been heavily, heavily based on mining and particularly on prices. Okay, let me, bearing in mind Harry's caution about the importance of disaggregating Africa, I'd like to ask anybody on the panel who wants to volunteer, what do they see as the, let's say, the 3 major impediments for sub-Saharan African growth in the future? You don't have to give 3, by the way. You can give 1. Somebody else will give another.
Let me start, since I haven't.
Yeah.
I guess I'm the next victim. I think in my mind there are to pick 3. One I think is governance. Political, economic governance. I think we can have all the other reforms that we want in the world, whether it's trade reform, whether it's education or the like, but unless we have a confluence between civil society and the political and economic leadership, we're not going to get very far in a sustainable way on the continent moving forward. And you can do a disaggregation across the countries on sub-Saharan Africa and do a correlation of those countries where there, or cross-country across the world where there's improved governance, you see sustained economic growth. The second is education, and particularly secondary education. There has been improvement in primary education in terms of percentage of Africans enrolled in school, that to be sure. The percentage increase in secondary education is woefully lacking, we know that, and that relates to the lack of a skilled workforce for tomorrow. And without that, again, African companies, again, taking into account the heterogeneity on the continent, are not going to be competitive because that's a very important factor of production. And finally, which was touched on just a moment ago, is the lack of scale, the lack of regional integration on the continent. And we have a couple of very large countries on the continent, but the continent is cursed by the fact that it's geographically fragmented, populated by a large number of small countries. And I think, certainly in the next 10 years, perhaps, we're not going to get megacities. We're not going to get populations that are going to allow for world-class investors to drive down the average cost curve and get the kinds of economies of scale that one can attain in India, that one can attain in China or other countries that large African countries will want to compete with. So, the question is, how can Africa as a continent spearhead regional integration? And to date, it's not been doing a very good job for a whole host of reasons, which we may want to come back with. But for my money, those 3 things, governance, secondary education, and regional integration, if we could solve those 3 things, we'd make a great deal of headway.
Shanta, do you agree?
Yeah, I agree with this first on governance, but let me suggest that, and the other 2 I'm going to suggest are complementary to what Harry said. But one of them is employment. What we're facing in Africa, in fact, in low-income Africa, unlike some of the middle-income countries in North Africa, is not a problem of unemployment. In fact, most Africans are fully employed. The trouble is they're employed in very low productivity work. They can't afford not to be employed. There are no unemployment compensations in that field. And so as a result, you see 70 to 80% of the labor force in the informal sector, mostly in single-family household enterprises, working on very low productivity activities and also unable to take advantage of any economies of scale, even of the type where you have a firm of 50 people, you might be able to buy a machine that can increase your productivity. And I think this is a fundamental challenge, particularly for the young people. We have 7 to 10 million young Africans entering the labor force every year, adding to a total stock of about 200 million. The second, and again, it's similar to what Harry was saying, but I'm increasingly impressed at how many different types of external shocks to which poor Africans are subject. So you have a combination of food price shocks, fuel price shocks, macroeconomic shocks like the global economic crisis, and add to that natural disasters, which are actually increasing now with climate change. You add to that health shocks, idiosyncratic shocks like HIV, AIDS, and malaria, and you add to that the shock of political violence and conflict. And you think about a poor woman in Burundi, in rural Burundi, she's faced with all 4 or 5 of these shocks at the same time. And you think about what that does to somebody who may be right at the cusp of poverty. This could easily put you below. Worse than that, since there are no insurance mechanisms to insure against these shocks, these people have to undertake all sorts of adaptive behaviors that are suboptimal, that leave them poor. They have to take the children out of school. They have to hold their livestock as an asset, and then they have to sell the livestock when times are bad. And I think shocks and the ability to be resilient to shocks can be some of the biggest game changers in Africa.
Very good. Wanji, anything? Then we'll move to sectors.
I think the question is, I think governance is important. And one question is, I mean, do we see any one of these as more important, or are they interacting? Is it a question of interactions? And I just would like to say, I am in this, I'm an advisory panel of the Human Development Report. And last year we evaluated the performance of various countries over the 40 years. And the result was what we call the North African miracle. Which
North African what?
Miracle.
Miracle.
Yeah, and that included Morocco, Tunisia, and so on. So it was a very good story. So the human development, I mean, Malawi had, I think, higher life expectancy, or children in school than Tunisia 40 years ago. And it was amazing for us to see that. But now, when you look at what's happening now, the human development indicators in North Africa have been very good. Health, education, quality of life generally. Now, so some people are saying, but of course, there was what we call the democracy deficit. The question is, what would we say comparing North Africa and South Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa? And one argument is, if we invest heavily on human development, we probably could drive democracy, which is consistent with the Ripset hypothesis, that as people get more advanced, they are going to demand rights, and you've got to get more self-sustaining democracies. So without being critical or being controversial, I would say in Africa, what I would like to see a lot is investments in human development.
Very good. Please feel free to be controversial. You are most welcome to be controversial here. Okay, let me move then from the big picture to a little bit on sectors of the economy. And I'd like to ask anybody on the panel who wants to volunteer whether they want to distinguish between different sectors within Africa. I realize, again, you have to think in terms of different countries and groupings. But can you try and generalize? Are there some sectors that have really been leading the growth in Africa? Vincent has already mentioned mining. And other sectors that are lagging behind, particularly important sectors that are lagging behind, and that may represent an opportunity for the future.
Sure. Let's distinguish between two types of sectors, sectors which are export-driven and sectors which are domestic. In terms of domestic sectors, we saw a lot of growth in construction and retail because of the overall growth, but also because of macroeconomic reforms. But as Shanta mentioned, the growth in these sectors has happened through essentially very low productivity informal jobs. I mean, that's where people ended up in terms of urban cities. So there is a real challenge as well as an opportunity to rethink the way cities are growing in Africa. And we can go back to that critical issue later. Essentially, the way land market works, the way decentralization has happened, I think we need to rethink what's going on. Because if we don't do something there, we will have growth, but low productivity growth, which will end up in terms of mega slums, which is already happening. So there's a real challenge and opportunity on the domestic side around retail and construction. On the export side, I mentioned mining, and the performance has been quite impressive. It could be even better if the volumes were to increase more. There have been a lot of restrictions in terms of licensing and back to governance issues in the mining sector, as well as challenges with infrastructure, getting the stuff out. And there are some interesting solutions there by which the private investor can actually build the infrastructure. It becomes a kind of public-private partnerships, and that infrastructure can be useful to other sectors. So even in mining, there's large untapped potential, which could actually benefit many other sectors for the building of infrastructure, which is still badly needed. Tourism did well. Africa's market share has increased in tourism. And that should continue with, especially as airline fares go down, now that you have regional carriers putting pressure on the traditional carriers, which were very expensive. So tourism looks good. The two main challenges and opportunities going forward is agriculture and light manufacturing. These are the two big nuts which need to be cracked. The market share of Africa in these two sectors have declined in the last 20 years. Despite Africa having the largest arable land areas, Africa is a net importer of food, which is really surprising given how much land there is. And in light manufacturing, the same. Africa imports 10 times more light manufacturing products than it exports. Despite that, now it has the lowest wages in the world. So these are both the big challenges and opportunities going forward. We can discuss what should be done later in the discussion for these two.
Well, these two, agriculture and manufacturing, and particularly within agriculture, I think you also have in mind agro-processing in particular.
Yes.
Agro-processing and manufacturers, that's pretty important. I mean, because these are the kind of sectors that have a high potential for sustaining growth over a long period of time, as we have seen in economies that have become developed or grown rapidly over the last 250 years. The rest of the panel, do you want to comment on agriculture and on manufacturing? Is pretty big stuff.
Well,
yeah.
I would certainly agree with Vincent about agriculture. I think the bottleneck there about agriculture is infrastructure to make agriculture happen. Water systems, transport systems, access to markets, and these are two sides of the same coin. And this is where, at least now in my job, in terms of getting private investment to come into Africa, you find the big agriculture firms are interested, but gee, how can I partner with infrastructure firms to come in at the same time? And this is the hard nut to crack, and this is what we're trying to do, to establish company-to-company agreements to come in together. And this is the nature of the game, I think, in getting investment into Africa. The other sector that is going to take off and is taking off in Africa, and not just among South African firms, but you see this now in cross-border investment by Kenyan firms and others, is the retail sector. With a burgeoning middle class, retail is becoming a growth industry in certain parts of Africa, in the 15 countries or so that are the fast growers. This is important also like agriculture because it's labor intensive. So I think agriculture, infrastructure, and retailing, as well as finance, in my mind, those are the sort of four important sectors.
Good. Yeah.
I mean, there is one huge success story in Africa, and that is mobile phones. Mwangi mentioned this earlier. And this has potential not only as a sector by itself to grow, and it's already, it's 60, 70% of Africans have access to mobile phones, but also as an input into all these other industries. There's a possibility that information technology can actually solve some of the problems, even some of the infrastructure problems that Harry was mentioning in agriculture. We have farmers in Mali who can use their cell phones to find out which place has the best prices for their product before they set out to sell. And this creates price convergence much more rapidly. They can also get weather information on their cell phones. And of course, the famous M-Pesa, the mobile money revolution that started in Kenya, it's a Kenyan invention, is now spreading to other parts of Africa.
Munji, anything you want to say on sectors?
Yeah, I just would like to emphasize, these are actually very good. I would say that it's really, we can't, again, which is a point about this sustaining the growth. If you cannot feed the population, it's very difficult to think about moving ahead. So I like this idea of really focusing on agriculture. And the issue is agricultural productivity. And that is actually related to infrastructure. I think that's a big issue in agriculture. And we have also seen very good success stories. I mean, we have the horticulture industry, where you have good infrastructure. We have seen, people cut flowers going to Europe doing very well. We have some farms in East Africa that grow green beans and carrots, and they are packaged and barcoded in Africa. And the next morning, they are in a shop in the United Kingdom, and they just go straight to the market. So Africa can be actually competitive in these areas, but infrastructure is key.
Okay, let's move then to the third and last chapter of the structured conversation.
Ulrike?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Just on sector, I agree infrastructure is key for agriculture, but I wish it was that simple. There are many other factors, and one has to look one country at a time, one crop almost at a time. For example, in rice, there are barriers to importing high-yield seeds. And unless you can import high-yield seeds, it doesn't make sense to invest in fertilizers or even irrigation. So one within specific value chain has to look at specific barriers. Another example, I was in Congo last week. There are millions of hectares in Congo of the best land farm, which are in the shape of abandoned, thousands of abandoned farms in the Congo. Abandoned farms. Yeah. And here the issue is governance and access to land. So, it's not only infrastructure, it's also fertilizer markets, seed markets, and the way one can access the land. Land is not the problem, accessing it is the problem.
Okay, can you give us a synopsis, any of you, as to why the famous Green Revolution hasn't taken hold in Africa? I mean, this is really the heart of the agriculture issue, right? What is the wisdom on why the Green Revolution has taken hold in India, for example, has taken hold in very, very poor countries in Asia, but not in Africa?
Well, I think Vincent was onto it. It's a sort of to use the economist lingo, it's a sort of a general equilibrium problem that, you have a land cadastre problem, you have a lack of infrastructure problem, you probably have a trade policy problem. It's a systemic problem, and you need to have the government. It's frankly a public good problem. It's not just it's a public-private partnership problem, and it needs to be concerted effort. And I think in most, I'm not an agricultural economist, but I think in most success stories in emerging markets, this has been the secret of success. It's not been wholly a private, venture.
Okay, it's not totally clear to me why infrastructure is so much better in large regions of sub-Saharan Africa than it was in India 20, 30 years ago. Even today, infrastructure in India is pretty disastrous.
Well, not necessarily in the areas where the Green Revolution took off. Remember, the Green Revolution started on the Indus Valley Basin, and there they actually had good irrigation and power because they had started that in the 1950s. And the Green Revolution in other parts of India, like Bihar, have yet to take off.
Right. My understanding of the Green Revolution, you need to get the seeds, the fertilizers, the irrigation, and the farmer skills to work together, and then access to markets. So it takes at least 5 things to work together. And in Africa, it has been difficult for government to get these 5 things right in a scale which makes a difference, frankly.
All right. Okay, good. Let me then move on to the global community and the relations between Africa and the global community. And the first question I want to ask is aid. Does aid really help Africa today, the way it is administered? I'm asking this question because, it just seems like every donor's got a different priority. When you go into these countries, the donors are all over, and they seem to be running the place. But when I say running the place, I mean running their own particular agenda. And that makes it very, very difficult if you have the money for people to actually run the country. So aid, does it really help? Mwanji?
Okay, so, Shanta will do this business. That's what he does. So
yeah, but I don't want to hear from Shanta only. I want to hear from you. Yeah, yeah, I know
okay,
it's Shanta.
So I'm actually, we are at one of our areas of focus is really aid effectiveness, because we know resources matter, but we also know that it depends on how you use these resources. One of the things that have always bothered me, and I think many people have seen this, is when you look at the macro level and you look at the impact of aid, you don't find it. But you look at micro, so there's this micro-macro dichotomy about aid. If you look at a project, look at maybe a HIV project, look at a seeds project or something like that, you are going to see quite a bit of return. But it is in this macro thing, you have to be very careful how you study aid. I would like to give you an example, for example, which, again, Shanta has done and I have also been involved in, which is on aid to education, where if you look at resources that flow to a primary school and you track it down through what World Bank has been doing, which is the expenditure tracking surveys, some of the surveys would show you that a very small fraction reaches the money is there, but it doesn't reach the schools where the money is supposed to go. Now, that's not a problem with the resources, but the resources have leaked somewhere on the way. Or what, again, World Bank has called quiet corruption, is that you go to a school, it's funded by resources from outside, but the teachers are not in school. So it's a question of how we make these resources useful, and it's, again, a governance issue. But aid, yes, can play a very important role, but it has to be used effectively.
Okay, I will come back to Shanta, because Shanta is, chief economist of the World Bank. So, Harry, aid, does it really help Africa?
It certainly can, and it certainly has in specific instances. I think the problem that you've identified is this vertical stovepiping and self-interest of particular programs and the lack of coordination and the tax that places on the host governments. I think that's the most pernicious impact of aid. But well thought out programs that are well specified, where there's responsibility and ownership on the part of the borrower, I think it can be extremely helpful. To me, the relevant question is not whether aid is helpful or not. The relevant question is, in the stream of things that can aid or assist or promote development, how effective is aid out of this entire toolkit? Aid is one of those instruments, as is trade, as is foreign direct investment, as is other kinds of things. It seems to me that aid should be part of that picture, but as a sole tool, never. I don't think it ever was envisioned that way, and I think that becomes a straw man argument.
All right.
How's that?
Okay, yeah. Shanta, yeah.
Just a couple of comments, really. I think everything has been said. First, let's keep in mind that during this period of economic growth in Africa, aid has increased. If you add on just the official level of aid that's gone up, plus the debt relief that started in the late 1990s, there's been almost a 50% increase in aid to sub-Saharan Africa. So there's at least some correlation. Causality is a different issue. The second is, you're right about the aid fragmentation, that donors come in with individual agendas. But as Harry said, the burden is on the recipient. If the recipient can manage it, you can use all of this aid effectively. And I think the best example I have now is Rwanda. The Rwandese actually have produced a matrix. The columns are sectors, the rows are donors. And they say each donor has these cells, and that's it. You can't go in anything else. And some donors get very upset, including the World Bank, when they say this. But I think that's exactly the right way to do it. That they specify, we want you to be in there. But finally, and I think your other question was, what can the donor community do better? And I think the answer is yes. And let me just say one other thing, which is really quite disturbing. Because we find, in this aid effectiveness literature, that not only is aid effective in countries with good policy environments, but aid is exceptionally effective in countries that have suffered a negative shock, in order to cushion coming out of a shock, as we saw in the global financial crisis. The trouble is, if you look at the historical evidence, this is precisely the time when aid is pulled back. Aid is actually pro-cyclical. So we're doing exactly the opposite thing than what we can do if we want to improve aid effectiveness.
Good, thank you. Let me move, taking the cue from Harry, who said you have to look at the broader picture. Trade. Does the trading system today, as currently as configured, help Africa or does it hurt Africa? Why do I ask that question? I ask that question partly because we know there are very important agricultural barriers to exports. Africa, on the other hand, gets preferences. Preferences are themselves somewhat controversial because preferences are unlikely to be durable, and they create a certain dependency, just as aid does. And I'm also asking the question because of what Mwangi said about the difficulties of Africans selling to each other and trading with each other. So today, if you were redesigning the world trading system, would you design a very different system for Africa, or is the current system okay? Mwangi.
Well, first of all, in terms of market access, Africa has pretty good market access. I mean, there are a lot of goods that are quota-free and duty-free. That, I think for US now it's over 5,000 items that can be sold to the US, even without the non-tariff barriers. So there are a lot of items. But I think, to me, in terms of trade, and the EU, for example, has the preferences also, which have been there for a long time. And Africa has actually exploited these preferences. But at the bottom line is that international trade is also equivalent to competitiveness. So if you are not going to be competitive, you are not going to sell a lot. So our big issue is not so much market access as it is being competitive. However, there are, of course, barriers. The American, as I said, with Kenya and East Africa have been selling green beans to EU. To sell green beans in the United States, which have been sold to Europe for a long time, has taken 7 years to get approval from the Food and Drug Administration. Surely the Europeans are quite as conscious of health as the Americans. But of course, the American farmer is a smart one and invests in political, politics. So there are a lot of barriers. So I think there are some barriers, but I don't want to blame our failure to access to sell outside to barriers. It's more competitiveness.
Anybody?
Sure.
Yeah, Harry? Yeah.
I would love that. By the way, if the job is open to redesign the world trade system, I'd like that. If the salary is reasonable. I think it's interesting. There's so much attention paid to protectionism on the part of the North vis-a-vis Africa and the market access question, and we've done a lot of work. I did a lot of work with some of my colleagues here in the audience on SouthSouth protectionism with respect to Africa. And when you look at the tariff data, particularly the escalating structure of tariffs with respect to African exports in countries like Brazil, China, and India, you find that that's frankly where the more pernicious trade barriers are than in the North. So if there's a market access problem, it's not in the North, it's in the South. And so a lot of the discussion in the Doha round, in some sense, is misplaced. And I think this point is really exemplified by one of the case studies that we explored in Africa's Silk Road. It was a Zambia cashew nut farmer who actually traces his heritage back. He's Indian, but he's selling cashew nuts, trying to export cashew nuts to India. And he can sell these cashew nuts in raw form to India quite profitably. But he cannot sell these cashew nuts once they're processed profitably to India because the tariff rates on processed cashew nuts are extremely high. So what's he doing? He's selling these processed cashew nuts packaged as organic cashew nuts to London and making a killing. Okay? So there's a great example of South-South protectionism. But I think the general point is also that even if market access problems were eliminated, whether in the South or the North, we still have this behind-the-border competitiveness problem in Africa, engendered by, in part, all the problems we've been talking about in terms of skilled labor, and in terms of lack of infrastructure and the like. But first and foremost, let's solve this market access problem while at the same time dealing with this behind-the-border competitiveness problem.
What about the intra-African trade, trade within Africa? There are a lot of issues there. Some of it is transport and et cetera, but there are also trade barriers within Africa. Am I right? Does anybody want to pick that up?
I would say the biggest problem is what Harry was talking about, the behind-the-border trade logistics that impedes within country, within Africa trade much more. There are some border constraints, but I would say they're also honored in the breach. I mean, what you do observe is a lot of smuggling because these borders are quite porous. But that also has its problems. Between Nigeria and Benin, you have a huge amount of petroleum products being transferred because Nigeria used to subsidize gasoline. They just got rid of their subsidy, and now Benin is in trouble because they were actually making a killing on the trade with Nigeria.
This is a huge problem. This inability to trade on the continent, as before I said about this economies of scale, that was on the investment side, but on the trade flow side, we have these regional trade agreements. We all know that there's this spaghetti bowl of overlapping agreements. No movement of any serious nature has been done to harmonize these RTAs. And frankly, the market, the firms are way ahead of these institutional agreements and just don't pay attention to them. But they're in the way because they're trying to look at these complex overlapping rules of origin. And this is a huge issue.
Good. Okay, let me move on to the other element, which is foreign direct investment. Again, what could be bad about foreign direct investment? Why would I ask the question, is FDI good or bad for Africa today? Well, one of the reasons is a lot of the foreign direct investment goes into mining sectors, et cetera, and there's always a question about, are they paying the right price? Are the right conditions being set, et cetera? Is this an economic endeavor, a successful economic endeavor? To what extent is it an exploitative endeavor instead? Anybody want to pick that up? Yeah.
FDI can be, actually FDI should be greatly beneficial in most sectors for most countries, but it's not so. And mining is a great example. Even if you get mining right, it's not totally obvious to get spillovers beyond mining into the economy. Even Botswana, which arguably has been the best country in terms of mining FDI, there's still very high unemployment, or they are big employment. I mean, mining did not solve all of Botswana's problems by long shot. They did a little bit of processing of diamond, but it didn't go very far. I think in the case of mining, and there have been some attempts at building linkages, suppliers into mining, but that doesn't go very far. I think the big upside for mining is getting the most revenues out of it and then spending that revenue smartly, including the infrastructure, the related infrastructure. Agriculture, I think, is you have similar issues, and it's very topical now. You have big deals happening in agriculture all over Africa, thousands and hundreds of thousands of hectares. But in many cases, we see some of the same mistakes as with the mining deals, where these great assets are not necessarily going to the right companies for the right right reasons. And so one sees either, investments which are silos, really, agriculture investments which are silos, which are just to exporting back to the country of the investor, and that could create some social issues. And it's not clear that the land has been sold at the right price either. So we see similar issues and challenges on the agriculture side that we saw on the mining. That is probably today the biggest challenge as far as FDI is concerned in Africa. And yeah.
Yes, one.
I would say I think that's a very good point, and I think when you look at the new investments, particularly by the BRICS, think about China, Brazil, and so on, and see they are really focusing on natural resources and not so much. Although I know that China and India are also investing in some manufacturing. I think we need to evaluate aid, FDI like we do aid. I think it's not just aid, the quantity, but the quality of aid. I think we need to have a measure of the quality of FDI also. And to me, if eventually for Africa, really, in terms of long-term economic growth, we really have to focus on transformation. If you are just going to mine and get the oil out, it doesn't change how people do their agriculture, then it's not going to have real salutary benefits on other sectors. So I think we need to see what investments, FDIs, can actually transform African economies.
Shanta?
Only the underlying concern is the fact that the bargaining power between some African countries and the foreign investors is not symmetric. And as a result, some of the deals, some of the contracts that are signed are heavily biased towards the investor and not in terms of the country. We have, there was a Chinese deal in a multi-$7 billion deal in DR Congo to extract some minerals and then ship it out, where the price and the quantity of minerals, both of those were guaranteed by the Congolese, even though the minerals hadn't been extracted or even discovered yet, because of asymmetric bargaining power. So I think that's where we need to work on, is how can we strengthen the bargaining power of the African government so that they can be on an equal footing with the foreign investors.
Well, let me ask then, along these lines, China's increasing role in Africa, which has come under a lot of scrutiny and criticism in the West. And my question is this just sour grapes? Is this just, this used to be ours, Africa used to be ours. And now the Chinese are coming in out of the blue, and they're going in and they're investing and they're building, et cetera, and why are they doing that? Or is there a real genuine concern about China's, I mean by that an economic concern, about China's involvement in Africa? Harry, maybe you want to pick that up?
When you say ours, are you talking about the fact that you hold a French passport?
Yes.
Just want to make sure.
I'm talking about my French passport.
Just want to make sure.
Yeah.
Or
British, or,
I just want to make sure for the
even
record.
German or Portuguese. Yeah.
It's obviously a very complicated story. I think there are many sides to this coin. I mean, there's apprehension on the part of Africa or Africans, and even there, depending on who you talk to within Africa, you get a variety of different points of view, whether it's consumers, workers, university students, and bosses and government officials. They're all over the map. In my view, the Africans are recipients of foreign direct investment from the South, which is qualitatively different than foreign direct investment that historically had come in from the North. And the terms are innovative, they're different. They still suffer, as they did from the North, with asymmetric information and asymmetric bargaining power, as they did from the North. But part of me thinks, well, thank God someone's at least investing in Africa, and is doing so in sectors that were off limits, that were perceived to be off limits, that were perceived to be too risky. And what's happening, and what you've seen, is that European investors and U.S. investors are upset in some sense because they're losing some first mover advantages. It's one thing, having worked in China since 1993, where we were at the bank elsewhere promoting China to become, growing out of the socialist economic market to become more like capitalists and to rove the world as profit-maximizing multinationals. So, they go to Africa. There are very few constraints in the market in terms of product standards, health and safety standards, and they're profit-maximizing, subject to no constraints. And all of a sudden, they come to Africa, and now the World Bank and the West says, no, wait a second, we didn't really mean that. We don't really want you to be capitalists. We want to put some constraints on you. And the concern is not so much to criticize the Chinese as much to say to the Africans, guys, this is your responsibility. It's the Africans' responsibility to put at the border health and safety standards, competition standards. And you'll find that the Chinese will respect those standards, just as they do in the US when they try to import toys with paint that was, unhealthy. And so for me, to ask the Chinese to voluntarily behave in a somewhat different way, I think is a bridge too far in some sense. That where the responsibility really lies is on the Africans to say, you know what, these are our economies, we welcome foreign direct investment, we want you to come here, but here's how we want you to invest.
Good.
And I think in South-South, I think there's a commonality there that can be mutually advantageous.
Good, good. Anybody? Yes.
Yeah,
please.
I think I totally agree with Harry. It's really up to Africa to take the most advantage of not only China, but India for ICT,
Absolutely.
Brazil for agribusiness.
Absolutely.
And that's the great news about South Africa. These people just came through the development stage, 20 years ago. So what they've learned is totally relevant to Africa today. And it's a great opportunity. And also, if we can help facilitate that, so be it. So China could really put Africa on the light manufacturing map. I mean, I was in China 1 month ago. Nobody in China knows that the wages in Africa, like in Ethiopia, are 5 to 10 times lower than in Africa. Nobody knows that. Chinese, instead of building cement plants in Africa, they would build, export-driven light manufacturing. If we could just set up the industrial zones in the right places, I think the right kind of Chinese investors would come with major impact. And same in agribusiness. If we can, bring the land to the Brazilians in the right kind of way, major opportunities.
Good. Let me ask my last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to the audience. Shanta began by stressing the issue of governance. And a week ago, we had an event here at Carnegie where we discussed Tunisia and the implications for the Middle East and North Africa. And out of that event came the message that essentially the turmoil in the African countries is really about voice. It's about corruption, and it's facilitated by technology. And so I want to ask the panel, in Africa now, there's quite a bit of technology. People have mobile phones. Lots of people have access to the internet. Not as many as in North Africa, but there is access to the internet. And there is, as I understand it, no shortage of corrupt and autocratic regimes in Africa. Is what's happening in North Africa, will it have some spillover effects in Africa? Are we seeing any signs at all of this? Mwanji.
And actually, I have a posting that probably is out now at the Brookings website on this issue.
Don't go there, by the
not
way.
now.
Yeah. Don't go there. Go to the Carnegie one. We have also our own. Sorry. Go ahead.
I'm calling it the Arab democracy paradox. And it relates to these human development issues and then the demand for democracy. And one of the statements there is that this movement is not going to cross the Sahara. And the reason is...
not going to cross.
It's not going to cross the Sahara. There will be some noise here and there, but I think there are a lot of factors. Look at the people who are doing this. They are reasonably well fed. They are urbanized, they are educated, and they can communicate. Of course, there are cell phones. And I don't think that, and then the education levels are much higher. So I think that it's unlikely, and that's why I was saying that maybe investing more in human development, in education, is probably one way that will push people like Museveni in the future in terms of being able to galvanize. There's another issue that is actually, we should not ignore it, about sub-Saharan Africa. In sub-Saharan Africa, we have this serious problem of ethnic fractionalizations that we may try to ignore. And even if there is a real bad dictator there who is killing people, he has his supporters who will come up and say, well, at least he is ours. So you are likely to get a broad movement in some of these countries. Even in Zimbabwe, you are unlikely to get everybody against Mugabe because one group will say, you know, he is our dictator.
Very good.
I think now
Shanta, you want to intervene? Yes.
I'm going to disagree with my good friend Mwangi for a couple of reasons. One is you see very much the same phenomenon of leaders who've been in power for over 20 years in Africa, sometimes over 40 years, and have eliminated almost any political space. It's just what we were observing in North Africa. So I think, you know, countries like Cameroon and so on, you really have to, there are a good chance that could face it. And already we're seeing some protests and so on. The other is that I'm not convinced about this idea that you need an educated urban middle class to run a protest movement. Look at Yemen. I mean, Yemen, the education levels and everything else are pretty much the same as in low-income Africa. And they've got a full-fledged protest going. And we've seen these kinds of protests in African countries, including in a certain East African country, that can rise up for various reasons. And I would almost turn it around the other way, that the ethnic fractionalization, which is definitely there, actually could precipitate something like this. Because what we also observe is that in these ethnically heterogeneous societies, the dictator is able to stay in power by doling out just a small bit of largesse to all of the groups. That's what Houphouët-Boigny did in Côte d'Ivoire. That's frankly what Paul Biya is doing in Cameroon. Now, if there looks like that dictator's days are numbered, then all of a sudden these ethnic groups begin to get very worried, and they take up arms. And that's how Côte d'Ivoire blew up, and we could see that happening. So it's a slightly different phenomenon than what we observed in North Africa, but it's still a change in power.
Very good. Over to you. Yes, sir. I think that's Professor Wanacott, I believe.
Thank you.
Yes. Please use the mic and identify yourself, please.
I'm Paul Wanacott from the University of Maryland. There seems to be a certain tendency to promote the Carnegie Endowment at Brookings' expense. I'd just like to thank you for what you've done at the Carnegie Endowment. And if you really want to promote it, I'd point out that there is a long history. Jacob Viner's famous work on customs union theory way back in about 1950 was done under the auspices of the Carnegie Endowment.
Oh, is that right?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yes.
Oh, well, fantastic.
So there's another arrow for you. Perhaps I could make an observation about China. I agree with much of what's been said, but it seems to me there's an additional complication which shows up, say, in the rare earth exports issue, and that is their apparent willingness to use economics for political purposes. Now, that's not historically new. The United States stopped exports to oil in 1938 or 39 to Japan, or 40, I guess it was, to Japan. It's been done, but it seems to me that the Chinese are being somewhat more aggressive on this matter than is considered appropriate, particularly at present. The question I want to ask is about South Africa, and it seems to have been almost conspicuously absent. If you go back 20 years, South Africa was looked at as the engine for the African development. I guess my question is sort of a broad one, is what's happened there, and what are the import restrictions which South Africa has? have they been a barrier to movements along this line?
Good. We'll take a couple more questions and then come back. And that's a question about South Africa. It's obviously very important. Yes, sir, the gentleman just behind Professor Wanacott.
I'm Abel Ejani from University of the District of Columbia. Professor Wanacott used to be my professor at Maryland in 1969. Anyway, 2 weeks ago, the International Monetary Fund advised the governor of Central Bank of Nigeria to devalue the Nigerian currency. And everywhere I go, in terms of policy advice, they seem to single out currency overvaluation as a major cause of retarded economic growth. What I would like to, Dr. Vajan to explain in a layman's language, how do you know when currency is, what is currency overvaluation? Have you done any empirical study to establish any connection one way or the other between currency overvaluation and per capita income? And finally, the issue of governance, political, economic. In 1978, if I'm correct, the last major conference Robert McNamara had, the former governor of World Bank, I challenged them to international agency to have a mutual agreement with 3 or 5 African countries, adopt them as a demonstration project so that they can run that country for 10 years to see whether there will be significant improvement in economic performance in that country. And I raise the same challenge again today.
Okay, so Shanta, you're being asked to show that you can run Africa. That's one. And the other that you can answer questions in layman's language, which is much more difficult for you.
For evaluation.
Yes, the gentleman just here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Teddy Roux. I'm a second-year MA candidate at SouthSouth John Hopkins across the road. I have a question for Mr. Palmade, very quickly. You discussed the light manufacturing, and I actually came across an article you posted, I think on the World Bank website, discussing the clusters of low manufacturing in China, SME. And I was wondering what prospect you see for that happening in, because you ended that article saying food for thought. And I was actually a little bit more curious in knowing what you think about the prospect for that happening in sub-Saharan Africa, the challenges, and what the World Bank is doing to push that. Very quickly, also, just a second point, if I may, to Mr. Broadman. I totally agree on the bargaining power and pushback responsibilities to African states in dealing with Chinese companies. I worked for the Sierra Leonean government over the summer, and what leverage you think that a government like the government of Sierra Leone can possibly have in dealing with Chinese SOE, especially when we have like very little interest for other private investors to invest in this country. I mean, I agree on the principle, but it's challenging. So I guess how could this country can be helped in dealing with China and China SOE? Thank you.
Good. We'll go back to the panel and then come back for another round.
I want to do the South Africa.
South Africa.
The South Africa. So Harry on South Africa and Mwanji then. Yeah.
First of all, Paul Wanacott has so many connections here. He was on the Council of Economic Advisors when I was the chief of staff there. So you're omnipresent here, Paul. On your first point about China as a mercantilist power and its outward strategy, you're quite right. I was, there's no question. I was addressing sort of relatively their conduct on the African continent and the share of blame to go around. On South Africa, South Africa is a very complicated, I would say probably the most economically complicated country on the continent, and once was the engine of growth on the continent and no longer is, and it was once the port of entry for most foreign investors on the continent, and is increasingly not the case anymore. And you can see increasingly that there are growth poles developing on the continent. As you go up the coastline, you can see that Namibia is a port of entry, Angola. You can see that Kenya is developing a corridor from Lamu up into southern Sudan and up into Uganda. South Africa, will continue to be a powerful presence, but 5 years from now, it will no longer be the primary engine of growth in Africa, and largely because of its trade policy, largely because of its industrial policy, largely because of the legacy of the outcome of the apartheid administration. And I'm seeing more and more investors who want nothing to do with South Africa and want to go elsewhere on the continent.
Good.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think South Africa, maybe 10 years ago, South Africa was doing very well also in terms of investing in other countries. It was sort of leading investments in other sub-Saharan African countries. But that has slowed. And I think there are real domestic issues. And I should have actually mentioned this in terms of sustaining growth in Africa. I think one of the things I see, the issue of inequality is going to be a real problem. And to me, it is what will trigger a lot of changes, but it's a real problem. In South Africa, it's particularly problematic, and particularly the issue of jobs. I think Shant has been talking about these jobs. And unless the labor issues, the climate, and a lot of the legal structures are changed there, South Africa is not doing well. So it's not as a few years back.
Yeah. Vincent, anything you want to add on South Africa?
Not really. I'm waiting for the...
Okay. So, Shanta, you have a second question.
Yes, although can I just add one sentence on South Africa? I think in addition to what both Mwangi and Harry said, South Africa also hasn't distinguished itself on the foreign policy stage, particularly in terms of Zimbabwe. And that has undermined its ability to play this role as a leader. Now, on the question from the gentleman from UDC, can I explain overvaluation in layman's terms? Well, I think I'll try. By the way, one of my former students, Alison Johnson, is here, so you can ask her. But it's if you believe, as there's quite a lot of evidence, that exports are extremely important for economic growth, then what an overvalued exchange rate does is it discriminates against exports. It makes it much costlier to export, and so people invest less in exporting, and then that means that the country doesn't have a big export base, and it then doesn't grow. So the overvaluation is simply the other side of the coin, or it's the price side of an export-led strategy. And now, in fact, there's some literature that shows that running an undervalued exchange rate might be actually beneficial, although that's somewhat controversial. The link with per capita income, let me give you one example, which actually I happen to have done, and it's a particularly graphic one, which is the countries in the CFA zone, the 13 CFA countries in West and Central Africa, where they were hugely overvalued, and we actually did a calculation in the sort of early 1990s to show that they were about 50% overvalued. And in fact, they devalued 50% on January 14th, 1994. And growth actually went from -1% to about averaging 5% a year for the next 10 years. So you actually got, now there was a maxi devaluation. It was not a small devaluation. Finally, on demonstration, I didn't know about this, that you had offered McNamara to the World Bank to run a few countries as a demonstration project, and I'm not willing to take that bait. But I do think that there's a small mini version of that, which are some of these special enterprise zones that people are introducing now in Africa, building on the experience in China and other places, which is, if you like, a little enclave within a country. As a demonstration project, where the rules within that special enterprise zones are different from the rules outside the country. And in fact, in some countries, people are even pledging for these to be special governance zones. So the mayor or the head of that SEZ will also pledge to have zero tolerance for corruption and have independent observers come in and examine it as a way of showing that you can actually pull it off, not in a whole country, but maybe in small enclaves of that country.
Good. We'll take a...
Uri, can I answer? I want to take advantage to answer the question.
Sorry, apologies, yes.
Because let me just give one example of what should happen. It's in Ethiopia. We just completed a very detailed analysis of light manufacturing sector in Ethiopia. And as I mentioned, in Ethiopia, the wages now are 5 to 10 times lower for low-skilled workers than in China. And the good practice firms in Ethiopia achieve 70% of the productivity level of the best Chinese firms. So if you do the maths, you see that this, in principle, is a gigantic opportunity. Now, the only issue right now in Ethiopia is trade logistics. There are 700 kilometers between Djibouti and Addis. If Ethiopia could build something like Shenzhen next to Djibouti, I think there is the potential to create Shenzhen in Africa right next to Djibouti with these kind of numbers. And Ethiopia is more than 70 million people, so there's a lot of employment. So that just to illustrate what could be done if you just, and in this case, all you need to fix is trade logistics. Everything else is almost there. There's a state-of-the-art port in Djibouti built by Dubai Ports since 2009, best in the world. It's waiting to happen.
And just, and I'd have to answer he also asked a question about the asymmetric bargaining on the small government. You know, governments in Africa are increasingly, like the Chinese, asking for outside help. I was in Ethiopia when I was still at the bank at a time when the Chinese were trying to buy the telecom company. They had Goldman Sachs in the room, the Chinese did, and the Ethiopians had nobody. This is being resolved all the time. So just because you're a small country doesn't mean that you can't have good negotiators. Sorry.
That's very helpful. No, sorry. On the contrary. Yes, so we take another round. We have time for, I think, three questions. And let's go to a lady. We haven't done ladies so far. Yes, please.
Well, I'll use my gender to take advantage of that then. Thank you. I'm excited to know, I'm Julie Mancuso. I'm from the Center for International Private Enterprise. We work with the local business community in Africa. It's great to hear the conversation of education come up and the youth bulge. However, whose responsibility is it to address it? And do you see an increasing role for the private sector to step in where governments have not? Or do you see them as investors pulling out, saying, you know, it's too complicated, it's too risky, especially in terms of destabilization for long-term growth? You see sort of, I guess, fragmented, like many efforts in Africa, very fragmented attempts to address it, but it's typically addressed from a human development angle, and I see it very much as an economic angle where the private sector is starting to more and more so pay attention. So could you maybe just discuss your view of the private sector role in education in Africa?
Yes, then the lady, you had a question too? No? Okay. The gentleman there at the back, and then yourself.
Thank you. I'm Marko Kaupinen from the Embassy of Finland. I spent nearly 5 years in Africa myself, and then later worked in Finland very closely with the AU-related issues. We haven't mentioned AU at all, African Union. What would be the role with African Union in terms of within the region, enhancing the competitiveness and so forth, and in terms of defending Africa in international fora? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes, I'm Bob Tortora from Gallup, and one I wonder with addressing this issue of inter-country trade, what does something like the East African community, does that have any potential impact on reducing barriers in the next few years? And I just have a general comment. In our surveying in Africa, we ask kind of a behavioral economics question about people's household income and how they're getting along, and we ask four categories. Are you living comfortably, getting by, finding it difficult, or finding it very difficult? And what we're seeing is that the percent of people that are finding it very difficult is growing dramatically. Over the last 4 years, it's gone from like 16% to over 30%. And the people that are kind of in that second group, second highest group, they're shrinking down. So to me, that's an indicator that there is some problems with sustainable growth in sub-Saharan Africa. If the general population is finding it very difficult to get by.
Good.
Okay, so I talking about the East Africa communities in a way is, we feel quite frustrating because East Africa community was ahead of the European Union. just some crazy people just, led it to, it's collapsed. There was East African Airways, East African Harbors, posts and telecommunications. We had a huge market, and all that collapsed because of politics. Now, I think now East African Community is on a fast track, already agreed on customs union. They are already debating possibility of currency issues. And what we have seen is quite a big boost in terms of trade between these countries. Again, there are still problems, but it's much better than other countries. I think the issue of regional integration, of course, has to be complemented with some the issues of infrastructure linking these countries, and it's happening. There are already some regional projects. I don't know how the progress, but there seems to be quite a bit of progress in particular roads within the country. So I see that as a very important channel to deal with some of these problems. Maybe just one comment on the African Union. I would see the African Union. You see, you have all these countries. I mean, the leader of African Union last year was Gaddafi.
It's equatorial.
Yeah, so now...
it was also, by the way, Libya, where I was born, by the way, was also the head of the Human Rights Commission.
Yes, I think it's just been kicked out.
Yes, yeah.
So AU as a concept, I think, is a very good one and has actually been doing well. It has some economic, there are some good economic forums now. They are coordinating. So I would say that, and it's also good in terms of conflict resolution. I would prefer AU to be the first one in Somalia than AU together with the UN than getting an outsider. It's much better. It's better dealing with Sudan and so on. So I see it as an important role. But we have to deal, again, with those people who are these are rotating president, headship, chairmanship. So you get a Gaddafi now and then.
Shanta, did you want to pick up on any of that?
Yeah, let me pick up on, I like this question about the education sector and the role of the private sector in education. First of all, if you just look at the facts, it's mostly as a result of the failed public system in education that Mwangi was referring to, the teacher absenteeism, the leakage of public funds. You're seeing the domestic private sector create schools. So in countries like Cameroon, about 50% of the primary school students are in private schools. And these are not sort of elite private schools. These are community-run schools, NGO-run schools. So there's a booming private sector. Now, in terms of foreign investment, what we're finding is at the tertiary level. But that depends a lot on whether the country, what kind of policy and regulations the countries have to allow private universities. But once the policy framework is set in, you find a huge rush. In Senegal, we have about a dozen private universities, and some of them are very, very good. So I think there's a huge opportunity for the private sector in education. And I think along with economic growth, Africans are now demanding more education, and so there will be a market for it. I just want to pick up on this last point about the number of people who finding it very difficult is growing. I think it's very, very important, because I think and we should not be complacent. This growth, the growth that Africa has been experiencing for the last 15 years, is pretty much a result of the first generation policy reforms kicking in. And so we're getting this big rush of growth. But what we've observed, say, in China and in India and other places, is once you've got that growing, you begin to see inequality growing. And so in the next 10 to 15 years, my biggest concern is exactly this. And I think you're sort of a bellwether, not you, but your surveys are a bellwether of what we might be experiencing. And it might be useful for us to at least not get complacent, but rather actually try to address the problem now, rather than wait 15 years and say, oh no, we let this blow up.
If I can complement this with, I mean, it's striking when you compare China and Africa, for example. In Africa, because of the way cities are growing through slums, essentially this informal sector, by the time the worker has paid for transportation, food, and shelter, there's really nothing left. In China, workers, because they are provided free housing, they live next to the plant, and even the food is subsidized, they get to save 80% of what they make. So that's kind of the difference.
Just, two very quick comments on the East African community. It's really the only economic community that is going to succeed in my view. On the private sector and education, from the foreign investors' point of view, more and more foreign investors that I work with want to provide education as part of a package of coming in to Africa, and they're really keen to do that precisely because they can't find the human skills at the ready, and so they're offering to train workers, and that is extremely welcomed by the government, and that is becoming a very much of a part of their program in almost every country I've been working in.
You didn't want to ask a question. Oh, you do. You do. Go ahead. Yes. This is the last question, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Thank you so much. My name is Allison Johnson, and as my former professor Shanta mentioned, have been really studying these issues since studying with him. And I'm really struck, as we're rounding out the discussion, to counter Mwangi's point about sub-Saharan Africa not being affected by the spillover from North Africa, as Shanta mentioned, could possibly spill over because of this issue of inequality that we're ending on. And so I'd like to pose the panel questions around looking out for the next 10 to 15 years, these issues of inequality, bad distribution of income. Because one of the things I've been struck by, because I've sort of migrated down to DC for many decades now, is that this Massachusetts Avenue area really did not see the challenges in MENA the way they took place the last 2 months. I mean, there really was just no vision that the uprisings would happen the way they've happened. And that's why we're just in a shock, I think, as a planet in terms of what to do with Libya, et cetera. What do we see for sub-Saharan Africa in that sense? If we challenge Mwangi's point that no, they're not going to uprise, although we all have friends that come through Facebook and tweet and tell us people are standing up all across these countries, they're organizing. Even if you don't have money, even if you're not rich or you're not super educated, people will organize, people will rise up if they want democracy, freedom, liberty. So could the panel project for the next years if there might be, because elections are what now? 20 countries across Africa are going to have elections this year? 17? That's a fair amount to question.
I will ask the panel to project as the last exercise we do today. But I have to issue a word of caution that 2 months ago, we organized a discussion on the Middle East, North Africa. And I concluded the discussion by saying that the main message that emerged is business as usual for many years to come. There is no change on the horizon. So, and it's on the record, so, yeah. That's why we don't get paid a lot in think tanks, by the way. But, all right, let me.
Same thing.
Yeah. So let me go to the panel then. Anybody who wants to pick it up on, whether this is going to spread south of the Sahara or not.
Can I clarify?
Yeah,
I didn't say that we cannot get riots in sub-Saharan Africa. We had them. I've been involved in some of them myself. But I'm saying that this mass movement all over our country is unlikely to, we are unlikely to get it at this movement in most of the countries just because you have dictatorships. Because some of the worst dictatorships, it will be very difficult if you think about it, the DRC and so on. So it's not going to happen. But I think inequality is one of the subjects that we must really be concerned about. I deal with that myself, and I know that inequality, and also, of course, we also now know it's not the Kuznets curve anymore. If you want growth, you have to, you really need to get more equal societies.
Okay, Shant.
Yeah, I'm not going to predict the next 10 to 15 years, but let me just add to what and Allison's question. And I'm not sure, I guess I can reveal this, but in the last 3 weeks, I've received maybe 4 or 5 requests from ministers of finance in sub-Saharan Africa, they say things like, Shanta, you've been talking about unemployment for a long time. Can you write us something about what we should do about youth employment? So at least they've gotten the message. Whether that's going to lead to anything is another question. But I think it's hopeful.
Yeah, I mean, I too, from a different perspective, know that certain countries, sub-Saharan, are very worried about what's going on. I named a couple of the countries earlier, Cameroon, Gabon, Uganda, for instance. There are some others, I think, that have some chance of having some kind of upheaval. Zimbabwe's in a special camp because he's going to live forever.
Right.
Well, just to echo Shanta, I was in Congo, Republic Democratic of Congo last week, and we had 2 hours with the whole cabinet and the prime minister on the topic of jobs, and that never happened before. So.
Well, I'm not even going to try and summarize this, this discussion, but I do want to recognize the exceptional expertise and sincerity of our panelists and the great, great job that they did today. Let me thank you.